Good evening. My name is Ivan Kane. I'm on the board here at the Writers Museum. And first, I want to welcome you to the museum. Now, the business at hand. I want to introduce our guests. Jonathan Lethem on the left is our guest on your right, on my left, one of America's finest novelists, essayists, and he does a lot of other things very well, too. His early books followed his early passions with science fiction, hard-boiled detective plots, and even a novel inspired by the John Ford, John Wayne movie, The Searchers. Next came what I will call Jonathan's middle period, a group of more, but not entirely realistic novels set in New York City, especially Jonathan's home borough of Brooklyn. These included Motherless Brooklyn, I call it goofy detective story that won the National Book Critics Circle Award for fiction, and Fortress of Solitude, an ambitious, semi-autobiographical story about a young man growing up in a soon-to-change neighborhood. For the past several years, Jonathan has been back in California teaching at Pomona College, and his recent novels have featured California settings. His latest work, The Feral Detective, you can buy from our bookseller in the back. But I also want to mention that Jonathan has also been an influential essayist and editor. He is champion among many others, Philip K. Dick. Jonathan edited Dick's Journals, and Bob Dylan, who is a subject of an exhibit here in the museum. And he recently co-edited a Library of America anthology of rock and roll criticism titled Shake It Up. I could go on and on about Jonathan, but we'll stop here except to add one thing. Here at the museum, one of our main features is a row of 100 featured writers in our main hallway in back. The writers are not necessarily the 100 best writers, although many would support them as among the 100 best writers, but they're 100 representative writers, of America. However, the really distinctive thing about them is they're all dead. However, Jonathan is actually featured with a quote on that wall. And I have my copy of a first edition hardcover of his latest book, The Feral Detective, and I'll give my copy of the book to the individual who tells me where Jonathan appears on the back wall after our presentation. Also with me tonight is Stacie Williams, who is director of the Center for Digital Scholarship at the University of Chicago. Stacie is a widely published progressive journalist and editor who recently issued a so-called bibliomemoir, I've seen it described as that, titled Bizarro Worlds. Bizarro Worlds addresses the gentrification theme in Jonathan's book, Fortress of Solitude, with gentrification being a code for racism. Jonathan flagged Bizarro World as soon as it was published as something he wanted to read. Now, I think for the first time ever, we've brought together these two distinguished authors, and I'll hand this over to them right now. I'll say the format will be they will have a discussion for 40 plus or minus minutes, and then we will leave some time for audience Q&A. So Jonathan, Stacie.
Thank you, Ivan.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Stacie, it's great to meet you.
It's wonderful to meet you. So I could maybe start and say how this portion happened, how we're like sitting here today, which was basically that I was just sitting at my computer and got an email from Allison, who works here, and said, yes, Jonathan Lethem has read your book and he would really love to sit down and talk to you. And then maybe I yelled in my office really quickly, and I forwarded the email to my husband and freaked out really quick, and then was like, oh my gosh, yes, that this little tiny book that I wrote would have made it made it across your path. I'm very flattered. Thank you.
I mean, I'm going to have a little difficulty saying this without getting choked up, but the most amazing things that can happen to you are the things you couldn't predict that your own explorations or just your desires will lead you to write these books, and then that they land anywhere is always amazing. And then to have something like this kind of echo come back it's the amount of excess in the reward, that such a thing should exist.
Thank you. Thank you for writing it.
Thank you so much for being remembering my book enough to write a book about it.
It was deeply compelling. So the question I have, because there was this point, this point made about it being semi-autobiographical, I feel like a lot of writers will say, yes, I've had these things happen to me and I should write about it. I need to write this. I need to tell my story. So like, at what point did you know that you were ready to write that story? And then, what was the process, I think, of that memory extraction?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the Fortress of Solitude was my 6th novel, and I began writing in a spirit of I completely foregrounded the imaginative act. I didn't think that I would write autobiographically, or I thought that anything that was autobiographical would always be inflected or kind of transmuted, and I would recognize it, but it wouldn't be the kind of thing that people would identify. And that just seemed natural to me for a lot of reasons. I grew up, my father is a painter, and I grew up reading comic books and watching films and looking at surrealist paintings and abstract paintings, and I always thought that the figurative, the surreal, the metaphorical, a lot of writers, I think, before they write fiction, write things that are more direct, whether it's essays or they're in academic work and they write a thesis or a dissertation, or whether they maybe just write a lot of journals. I did very little writing before I tried to write stories. In a way, I came to writing weirdly through making paintings. So I thought of my books as kind of imaginative artifacts, or sculptures, things you could kind of look at and they would give you feelings, but they weren't testimony. But of course, language isn't like a musical note or a color on a canvas. It actually has this trapdoor of content based, kind of baked into it. And the minute you begin telling any kind of stories, no matter how little you might think they have to do with you, they are autobiographical. But I was dedicated to the idea that there was no reason to get any closer to the autobiographical gesture than that the accidental and the compulsive autobiographical nature of my work was enough. And I certainly didn't think I was going to write about New York City. I was living in California in my 20s when I wrote my first four and a half novels. And I moved back to Brooklyn. And the first thing I did was write this sort of Valentine to Brooklyn in the form of Motherless Brooklyn. A very exuberant book that has to do, the energy in it has to do with rediscovering the kind of the vitality of street language, the way, something I'd missed living in California, honestly, was East Coast kind of sardonic vibrancy of the street encounter. Yeah. And I identified with it, but I found a metaphor in Tourette syndrome that was a kind of a way of writing about that and exaggerating it and heightening it. But the autobiography in that book was still very indirect. Mm-hmm. But in doing that book, Motherless Brooklyn, which was in a way of a piece with my non-New York, my imaginative fantasias my early novels represent, I started to accidentally name the world that I was from. I put the characters, almost inadvertently, I put them on the streets of my neighborhood in Motherless Brooklyn. They were going to bodegas and walking past grade schools that I'd gone to. And this was pulling feeling out of me, and much richer and much more ambiguous, and challenging feeling out of me that I was naming these places. So in a lot of ways, I think of it as beginning with street names, that I sort of tricked myself into this space where I would write something that was autobiographical. I'm still avoiding the word direct, because actually one of the things reading Bizarro Worlds made me think about was how much, even as I play the card, this book seems to, I'm pointing at your book, Fortress of Solitude seems to confess, okay, this is who I am and this is where I come from. And yet I used a lot of sleight of hand. I guess the habits of the imagination had become so essential to me. They were the only ways I could even get to the material. So, I know the ways in which the book invites and very meaningfully, very reasonably invites people to identify, like Dylan, the main character, with me. And I know I'm in there, but I'm also not in there in a way, or I'm in Mingus, his best friend, as well. And my brother is in both characters, and several of our friends are kind of, it's like each of those two boys is a kind of weird vehicle or container for a lot of guys I knew growing up, different aspects of them. And then again, the neighborhood and the events are transmuted in various ways. But reading your book, because you're identifying your own experience so directly, not with mine, because mine isn't on the page, but with Dylan's.
Yeah.
I sort of started to see a triangle, like you, me, and Dylan, and this kind of interesting triangle of identifications that was really rich for me. And it reminded me of writing the book, to see you thinking about it that way.
Well, that was the thing that I did find so compelling. I went back to the book because I knew I wanted to write about it, but I hadn't read it in so long. So I went back to it and I reread it as I was writing the proposal. And I had just been so sure that while there were these things that I could recognize that Dylan and myself were probably very, very different, or had led these different lives. But then when I started seeing the parallels, that was almost uncanny to me. And it started bleeding into these other things that I was writing, where I guess I just had like a voice in the back of my head saying, you have to tell the truth. Don't forget to tell the truth. It would be very easy not to, or it'd be very easy to draw myself as being in opposition to this character who maybe did have like problematic things happening, but seeing that there were parallels there that I could not really run from. That was really kind of a turning point to me. So I had started writing. I had written the proposal and I had a full first draft. And I'm sure, as you know, you get that first draft back and your editor is like, please try again.
You make reference to this in the first line of the book.
Yeah.
The evasive version that you...
Absolutely. And when I read back that first draft, it was like, oh, wow, I think I'd completely... there were maybe things that I had experienced, or things that I had heard, or things that I had lived or seen that I had put so far in the back. So I think going back to reading Fortress of Solitude, it very much helped to pull that out. And I would also add, when you talk about language and how being back in Brooklyn really pulled that out of you. That's one thing I love so much about the book, the musicality of the language.
Thank you.
I had to pick this isn't the first time that this book had even come up for me either. So a year before I even was asked to do the proposal, I was in a writing class and the instructor said, bring to next week's class a scene in a book that you think is just really rich and alive in terms of feeling and movement. And I chose the scene when they're in the hardware store trying to steal the graffiti, because the language there was so rich. It was like you had dropped us completely into one of the boys' phrases of speech. And that was also, I noticed that going back and forth in the book, we have these very different narrators looking in on these aspects of these boys. Sometimes it is Dylan, sometimes it's still in first person, sometimes it's still in third person. But that scene, I don't even know who the omniscient narrator really is, but it's all of the boys, and it's so alive. Like that scene crackled to me. So I read it start to finish.
Well, thank you. And you're giving me a really great opportunity and reminder to describe a feature of both the process that got me to the lucky place I got to in that, especially the first half of the book. I physically moved back to the neighborhood where I'd grown up. And I was also more in contact suddenly with other kids from the neighborhood. And I, didn't, it just sounds really stupid, like a acceptance speech or something. I didn't do it alone. I sat for hours and hours with my brother, Blake, and with Lynn Nonage, talking with my friend Dione, learning how it looked to them, triangulating experiences that I'd never spoken of before. All of us naming things. My friend Carl describing experiences that we'd had and comparing notes and, kind of creating this holographic image of the street in, 1975 and 1976 and feeling it again, but not alone, with their collective help. And so some of that polyphony, I specifically conceived the first half of the book as a kind of chorale of voices. The way it shifts, I mean, it's, in literal terms, there are points of view. There's even, Isabel Vendel's point of view, and Abraham's point of view comes in at some point. But beyond that, that kind of slippage into a collective, transcendental, voice of the street that's kind of looking at everyone was a reflection of the fact that I'd had to gather so many voices to bind them to my own vision in order to think about the place. And it also, gave me a metaphor for what was wrong with Dylan afterwards, is that he switches to the first person and he has no chorus around him,
He's alone. He's alone at that point.
And
he's gone so far away from.
Yeah, he's
Brooklyn.
without. And that's also why the thing is conceived as a. So the secret, dumb metaphor for the entire book is that it's a box set of a singing group, right? And in the first 2.5 discs of the 4 discs, they're together and you love it and their voices are all together. And then you get the solo careers and you're like, well, that's stupid. You guys belong together.
You belong together. Absolutely. So this is interesting. You went back to the block. Was your process very different once you had actually gone back home versus when you were, you're writing in California and touching on other genres and whatnot? Like, how did that change when you actually returned?
Well, I mean, I was just growing as a writer so much. And I could not, along with deferring the autobiographical material and feeling completely unready to think about New York and coming of age there, I didn't have the to speak of the kind of the dumb creative writing instructor's word, I didn't have the craft. I hadn't read enough of a certain kind of book to handle my own impulse to make a book like Fortress of Solitude. And it wasn't until, and in some cases it was reading, in some cases it was rereading. I mean, the keystone books for me in terms of thinking about how to do all the voices I wanted to do in this book were Baldwin's Another Country, which I had read as a teenager, and Christina Stead's The Man Who Loved Children. Both of which are crazy books structurally. They don't obey any law except the emotional necessity of their telling. They both unfold with a kind of broken structural logic where characters surge to the foreground and and take over, and you know them because it's time for you to know them. And I wasn't ready to be so disorderly until I'd really take, and another one that was helpful was Call It Sleep by Henry Roth. From Call It Sleep, I borrowed this fundamental metaphor that the kid is in a relation to the life of his family, where inside their house they speak Yiddish, and then he's thrown out he goes down the stoop and onto the block, and the kids are speaking American street English to him, and it's rendered as this weird, like, grunting sound initially. And this idea that the life of inside your house and the minute you go through the front door are two irreconcilable, incommensurable experiences, and yet you have to straddle them. You're doing that
because it's home.
Right, exactly.
It's home.
Yeah.
So actually, yes, with home, I also looked at another country as I started writing. I mean, I think I was looking for a lot of different voices, but I also wanted to make sure that I wasn't privileging my voice over these other experiences. I mean, like you say, they're the sum of a lot of these different interactions that you might have, or the sum of your various experiences out in the world. So while I was reading, I went back to another country. Actually went back to Adrienne Nicole LeBlanc's Random Family.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
That's it. I mean, so, yeah. Actually, I read that and Fortress of Solitude around the same time. So it was like getting these very different portraits of New York. And I think at that point I had not been to New York yet. So those New York stories loomed very large for me. Baldwin, also a New York writer. So that might have actually been even more about my process in terms of seeking out these different New York voices. I'd even taken it back to A Tree Grows in Brooklyn just to really get that historical kind of sense. What did this neighborhood look like, at the turn of the century?
The tree in A Tree Grows in Brooklyn is the ailanthus tree, which I'm obsessed with in the Fortress of Solitude. But I didn't know that when I started writing the book.
That's such a great story.
The thing about Another Country also is that, I mean, when such crucial experiences happen to you when you're a young reader and you are innocent of context and you immerse yourself in a book. And when I read the first 50 pages of Another Country, and I thought I was reading an entire book that was about Rufus, and then he jumps off the bridge, and I never recovered. I read the rest of the book, but I never recovered. And of course, no one in the book recovers. And that's been a model for me forever of the way a book can fall off a bridge. And the idea and that life involves loss, that is, the presence of someone's absence, because the entire book is about, and it's 500 pages after him. And I was like, wait, was it a trick? When's he coming back?
Like, no. Yeah, he didn't come back.
And that also permitted me to write about loss, to have the audacity to have, Rachel vanish from the book and never be recoverable. But the pressure of her absence is, is a consummate experience. I hope to me, it's, she's always there after she's gone.
She's always there, but it is definitely one of those things that's formative, I think, for Dylan. So I think what also resonated with me was this idea of him sort of always in motion, always moving away from Brooklyn, kind of running away from Brooklyn. So even around the time that I had done this, I was on perhaps my fourth or fifth city in 6 years or something. So
you were running.
There was a lot of running, actually. You're right. There's something about that innocence. There were so many things that I had not yet experienced, or just didn't necessarily have the language to use in processing those experiences when I first read the book.
And the names that you're offered are insufficient names, beginning, I think, with the word gentrification, which is like, it's one of those words, I think about this category a lot. Words were offered for things that don't really
don't,
exist.
Yeah, they don't mean what. They don't mean what you
enough,
labeled.
or like multitasking. There's no such thing. I mean, computers can do it. People just switch. There is no multitasking.
Yeah, it's really that was the truth too. It was like, well, what am I actually writing about if I'm simply talking about the process of these neighborhoods changing?
So, reading your book, I was thinking so much about what it was to grow up with this word that was offered to be against or for, and I could never orient around it. And as a child, I always had such bad conscience about gentrification because everybody I knew was on one side or the other of it, and I was somehow always wrong. Mm-hmm. I always felt wrong. And then I realized, actually, it's the word is trying to name something, and it's lying about it by naming it the way it does. That either it's much more intimate, it's individual encounters, or it's capitalism. It's what's wrong
systemic.
beyond. You can't carve out 8 or 12 blocks and call it Boerum Hill and then argue about what happens inside that container without looking at the space of American,
absolutely,
the histories of housing development and white flight and all of these things that are so immense, and that the lining up on one side or another of whether or what redlining.
Yeah. I think in writing that was also the part that was maybe a little gutting for me because, again, there had been this innocence around the time that I first read The Fortress of Solitude where, I had a sense about what gentrification was supposed to be. And I was sitting there living in a neighborhood that was gentrifying. I mean, it was peak gentrification. It was like an artist's work loft. There was a pottery kiln in the basement, and it was it was affordable housing, but it was still very much in this vein, in this largely Latinx neighborhood on the south side of Milwaukee. But when I went back to it later, I think the thing that I felt so gutted by was this idea that you can tell yourself or you can believe that you're a very good person, but you are making decisions as a part of this system that are almost preordained.
One is always a participant, and exactly who you sell a house to or rent a house to or from, and what happens in that space. You're enmeshed in a story.
Absolutely. And I mean, that was also what I found was interesting too. Once I realized what the truth behind that story was, and listening to how other people would frame their participation in that system, because as you said, we are all participating, I suppose, unless we go to the desert like Charles Heist, live out with the hippies and the rabbits and the bears. That's really the only way that you could consider yourself as outside of that.
And when you actually go to the desert, you realize that there are legacies and histories and invisible gentrifications going on, and dispossessions in those spaces as well. I mean, the fantasy of American free, open space is a fantasy. It's the founding fantasy, right? It hides
the original gentrification fantasy.
It hides a genocide before it hides a gentrification, right? Yeah. So that is the myth, and it was alive. The idea of an urban frontier,
And still is. I mean, there were people we totally knew in Lexington who would be like, we're pioneers. We got to this neighborhood. It's like, you got to this neighborhood in like 2011. Lexington was, a city like going back to the 1700s. So just this idea of even how people spoke about their presence in different neighborhoods and what it meant to amplify, what it meant to erase, and then you can't unsee it, I think was the thing that I really got out of both the books when I went back to The Fortress of Solitude. There's so many things that Dylan tried so hard. He couldn't unsee these injustices. Maybe that was why he had to go. That's interesting. So I want to ask. I'm doing a lot of asking. It's the journalist in me. I apologize. Genre. So you are, and I would add that along with more contemporary people now like Eve Ewing or Roxane Gay, who, you are writing across genre, which I've always admired so much. I think as a much younger writer, there were a lot of people were maybe telling me like, well, if you're going to write this, you have to stay in that lane. If you're writing fiction, you're always writing fiction. Or if you're writing detective novels, you are always writing detective novels. You are not allowed to branch out. But yeah, seeing your work across genres, I'm a huge science fiction fan myself.
You make some nods and comic books.
And comic books. So like reading something like that, or seeing Colson Whitehead write Zone 1, which is one of my favorites. How do you approach crossing genre, or is there a difference?
Well, I have so much to say about this, and it's so many different nested issues. I mean, talk about another word that's like tells too many stories to be one word, right? I mean, genre can mean formal patterns or form, poem, essay, novel, short story. When I grew up, it seemed like a category in a library. The spinner rack on 4th Avenue and Pacific Street at the library that had the colorful science fiction paperbacks on it. I was like, that's for me. I like that spinner rack. So that seemed really simple. And then I immediately found that I was actually most interested in the stories that were interfering with the pattern. When I would read, it was some of that was even emblazoned on the books. People would, I discovered Raymond Chandler, and it would immediately say, well, he's not really a crime writer or only a crime writer. And I thought, well, what does that mean? And so the energy for me is always in the interference pattern, the boundary, the limits of what people mean by genre. And I really liked writers who showed me where that edge was by fooling with it or performing some kind of trickster operation where I thought I was reading one kind of thing and it changed. And so I just wanted to do that. I just thought that's the higher sport in a way. And I was lucky, I think, when I came along, there were these amazing examples like Ursula Le Guin and J.G. Ballard in science fiction, or Patricia Highsmith, Shirley Jackson. I loved a writer named Thomas Berger. Did he make your 100? Oh, he should be up there. He's so good. Well, who kind of made a practice of transforming themselves with each book. And I thought that was what I liked about it, was that they were also helplessly themselves. They would turn out to be the same writer in different disguises. It was like a costume play. But also, I think some of this comes from my training in the visual arts, where all painters, it seemed to me, from walking around museums and going to galleries with my dad, including my dad, who was a painter, had periods, and their work was different at different times. And even within a given show, you didn't understand them by looking at one painting. It was the constellation of the rooms in an exhibit and the different faces that the different paintings had added up to a kind of like a kaleidoscopic or constellation kind of sense of what this person had to say. It's one reason I always felt I had to write a lot of books, not just one book, because I had the gallery in my head. I wanted there to be different faces. And the writers I liked were different at different times. So genre was a vehicle for trying to, express this appetite for difference.
I love the painter analogy that, you could, it's not going to be what you know about a writer from just that one book, but maybe really the sum of the work. And and those different periods, and how you as the reader are interpreting these things at very different points in your life. I mean, so that's always a thing that I would say before, that a good book is supposed to deepen over time, because we're always evolving, we're always thinking, changing, growing, and something will hit you differently in your changing period than it would have at any other time. So
Right. Yeah.
I love writers who play with genre. It's so exciting, and it makes me feel as a writer that there's just so much possibility, really, that there's so many options that I haven't thought about yet. I like that.
Hey, I'll mention, Stacie, you're a fabulous interviewing journalist. We're going to transition in a minute to audience Q&A, but you can wrap up any questions you're dying.
Well, I want to ask you.
each other.
I've got a question for you now.
Go ahead.
So I can't help hearing that maybe you're working on some fiction, Stacie.
Working on some fiction. So I had my first short story published last year. Thank you. And thank you. So yeah, the things that you said about place really resonated for me in terms of, something that looks semi-autobiographical. So it was a short story around, it was a short story basically just about a guy who runs into his ex at the mall. And of all of the elements of this story that I think people might have been like, ooh, is that the autobiographical part? The part that actually I was building that out of was the mall. It was very much in my head. Growing up in Milwaukee, there are actually some Milwaukee people in the audience. So the mall in my head was Grand Avenue Mall, which is a mall downtown. And, most of our malls these days, they've died, or they look really different, especially in cities like Milwaukee or in cities like Cleveland. What used to be the mall that you remembered as this grand place, you go into them now and they're shells. So really I used the mall as the vehicle to tell this story. And this guy is remembering all these things that were grand, like in the way that you used to remember a mall. But, really there was not anything there.
That's great. That's great.
So yeah, working on short stories, but I did just start something that could be sci-fi. I haven't decided yet how fully deeply I'm going in there, but just seeing these great writers doing that, it's like, yes, let me try. I love that form.
Dynamite. Can't wait.
Thank you.
You might know Ada Palmer, who's at Chicago, also a sci-fi writer.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, and she teaches this amazing Renaissance class where she assigns students roles, and they're plotting the downfall of Julius Caesar. I would love to take that class.
I'll give you another chance if you want to if you have a question for Jonathan, and then we'll kick it over to audience.
My final question I must know. DC or Marvel?
Oh yeah, it's funny. So the title of the book, right, Fortress of Solitude, seems to align so powerfully with Superman. But I always found Superman unbelievably embarrassing. And it was like Marvel was the world you wanted to be in, and DC was the world you might get stuck in if you were too nerdy and boring. No, Marvel all the way. Yeah.
Marvel all the way.
I'll tell you, I'll brag now because you'll dig this. I just wrote a one-page. So Marvel is doing. I guess they're coming up on their something 50th anniversary or some kind of celebration of themselves.
60.
They're putting out some kind of gigantic coffee table book, and they're asking a lot of people to write one-page pieces.
Exciting.
And so I just wrote a one-page comic about Black Bolt for Marvel.
That's so exciting.
With my two little boys.
Awesome.
Yeah, they were very excited. So they're working. I got my kids hired by Marvel. It's a work for hire contract, which is not a good example.
Well, I can't wait to read it. Thank you.
I'll mention Fortress of Solitude was what, Superman's?
It's Superman's hideout.
But that was stolen from the Doc Savage pulp series that had come out.
We have another nerd in the house.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'll have to ask you DC or Marvel after the.
Okay, good.
After we're done.
Can we start with some Q&A now? If you would speak up, if you're nearby, I'll try to give you a microphone, but just speak up.
You started out talking about your father and the music and the art, and then into writing. And I've always dichotomized the brain and saying, and obviously you didn't. The creative part and the music and like synesthesia, whatever, where you see color and
Yeah.
notes, but you put it all together, and I'm in my 70s, and I'm still waiting for the creative part. On the left brain and wanting to jump in. Any suggestions?
Oh gosh. I mean, synesthesia, I love the image that you bring to it, and that, that is it, just sort of like, I mean, everything is potentially expressive, but it usually takes kind of a leap or something analogical or figurative, right? Like, and I'll give you an example. A lot of the assignments I give creative writing students are basically just urging them to do something metaphorical. I'll tell them to write a conversation between two people, but the two people are feeling a lot and have some very large agenda between them, but they can only talk about the weather. So the key is sometimes in this restriction or limitation. What if you could only push things through some small channel? I mean, it's why I think it's so wonderful in a way that school kids are taught to write like haiku. Counting the syllables becomes this little window, this aperture through which their desire to reach and touch the world is forced, to go.
Thank you.
Well, thanks. Thanks for the question.
Other questions? I have one for Jonathan. She was talking about how to get creative in old age, and I'm worried about this myself. So Philip K. Dick, one of your favorites, one of your passions, his characters often seem to be helped by illicit substances.
Those can be helpful. But what's the question?
My question is, can those be helpful? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, very good.
And I'm not allowed to say more.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's a good tradition of a carefully managed, use from Coleridge and before. But you have to be able to, again, it's a matter of finding form. I mean, dreams are also helpful. And I would just maybe put those, really in a strange way, I'd put those in the same, or, life is helpful. Mm-hmm. Being turned on is helpful. Finding people that you're excited to talk to and having a crazy night at a bar, conversing all night, whether there are illicit substances or just really good cocktails involved. But then you have to move it. This in a way relates to the other question. Move it from that space of the dream or the experience or the drug trip into some form. And it's at that moment of capture that something happens.
Okay. I'm going to ask another question, but I want everyone in the audience to be thinking of their questions.
There's a hand up over there.
Oh, there we go. Steve.
When you went back to Brooklyn after so many years, and of course it changed quite a bit, as we know, was there a sadness to that experience? And especially with the people you grew up with, from an environment like Brooklyn, with people go so many different directions or don't go in any direction?
Yeah. Well, I mean, God, there's so many stories I could tell that your question evokes for me. And I mean, the feeling, so I grew up in a space in Brooklyn that was unaccountably conflictual and rich and beautiful and fractured. And I didn't have any handle on that. It was like anyone's childhood. It was the taken for granted, and it was the water I was swimming in, and I couldn't see beyond it. And then I did experience almost a feeling of having to salvage myself from that overwhelm. And I did it first by running away to college in New England. I was like, Green Mountains, Vermont. I can calm down here.
Running away to New England is a thing. I can attest.
And then I split for California. And I remember when I was working in bookshops in Berkeley at age 23, thinking, I'll never have to go back to New York again. and then it was coming up in my writing, but also the thing that most differentiates me from my character Dylan who Stacie knows so well, is that I had siblings. And also, I also, unlike Dylan, I had a talent for continuity in my friendship. So even though a part of me was divided against my childhood experience, another part of me was keeping in touch and still there at a certain level. And when I did go back, and I visited a few times in my early 20s, even when I thought I was somehow like renouncing New York City. And then increasingly I realized I'm of this place and there are people there who I always want to see. I would walk down Dean Street or Nevin Street, and there'd be guys I went to school with, or, older folks who were stoop sitters, Elva Jimenez. And she'd be like, Jonathan, where have you been? Haven't seen you in a little while. And I'd be like, I don't even know how to name where I've been, but not right here, and people would just think they hadn't seen me in a little while. And I realized the continuity was immense, even as this space was on one level radically transforming through the power of money and real estate and hype. And I could go crazy enumerating the ways in which it was transformed. I could equally go crazy with the ways in which it was entrenched in time. It was exactly where I'd been forever, that there was deep structure in the spaces of the buildings and the homes and the people who hadn't budged, and the schools that were being, the ladies with the deep Brooklyn accents working in the office at PS 38 who remembered me, who were still doing the same thing. And I was like, this place is going to make me crazy because of the doubleness. It's both utterly transformed and utterly entrenched in time. And that was the unnameable feeling that was very sad and beautiful and ecstatic for me all at once.
I have a question, and as this is going to be a question for both of you, but for Jonathan, the hint is this might give you a chance to talk about your latest novel, which is for sale.
Yeah, that's right.
Which is, how does a writer or an artist react to the age of Trump?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, I actually, so this is a reference in a way to, right, the Feral Detective. But I think that book is only deceptively an address from the age of Trump or to the age of Trump. It's really, it makes a kind of mention of it.
Just a little advertising. Yeah.
It makes mention of it. And I dared myself to do something that I would not usually advise like a apprentice fiction writer who I was working with in a classroom or mentoring in some other situation, or would usually advise to myself. I set the book in the immediate present and named a lot of particulars. It like set around the time of the inauguration in January 2017. But that's sort of an external layer on the events of the book, which then become, I think, for me, an exploration of mythic fantasies about the frontier and the past, and issues that are so much more, that maybe the moment of Trump's election became a kind of unmasking for certain feelings and conflicts and crises, but really they're so with us. And what happened was they were sort of desublimated for a lot of people at that moment.
Are you maybe being a bit subtle here? Because the book, the protagonist in the book is a female writer who quits her job upon Trump being elected, and the end of the book plays out at a battle royale in a post-apocalyptic desert. So seemed to be something going on.
Yeah, I mean, it's a book partly about feeling disarranged. And I felt disarranged at that moment. I think a lot of people experience that feeling. But then the next feeling you have, okay, was the world making sense and somehow it stopped that day? Or did it already leave me wanting and I was just kidding myself? And so it's a book about meeting your own disarrangement in an undeniable aspect, And the desert people in that book are, I described them at one point in the story as it's kind of a quip, as like survivors of a disaster that hasn't happened yet. But you know, we're certainly in a slow motion catastrophe, and the question is, where are we in it?
Yeah.
Right? How do we orient inside history that's legible in so many different ways, but incoherent at the same time, and we're under it. We can't get out from under it.
Stacie, you've issued your first book, written your first story.
Yes, but well, I do also still write frequently for other publications. So
Yes.
I think, how do you respond in the age of Trump? I do feel like I have pitched a lot of things that I think are very speculative about the future, or maybe what I think I want the future to look like, because you know, I think to a certain extent, it's not to say that the person in the White House doesn't have a lot of power, both real and symbolic, but there is real change happening, you know, on the streets with individuals who are coming together, finding these areas you know, finding these areas where they really connect with each other and where they can see powerful, strong change. So I just had a piece published in Belt magazine the previous week. You know, we here in Chicago, we have our mayoral election coming up, and for the first time, Chicago will have a Black woman as mayor. But what does that mean? You know, it is that milestone is great, but what does it mean? You know, and what is it that the organizers have actually been able to do? And it actually has been a lot. You have a lot of really strong organizing efforts here in Chicago, like the No Cop Academy, or like Asada's Daughters, people who are pushing to end the bail system as it currently exists here in Chicago. And those are the people who are actually getting our politicians to push in these directions that are more progressive. So I think as a writer, I'm trying to speculate what this better future could be, but try to amplify the people who are doing that work.
Yeah, and I mean, that's great. I love what you just described, and I'll just take one step further and say it's why science fiction is such a powerful vehicle, because it's literally a set of instruments for imagining the world other than it is.
Absolutely.
The question in the back.
Yeah, I have a question for either of you. I kind of relate to what you just mentioned, actually. Mr. Lethem, I know when you Occupy Wall Street, you went to Occupy Wall Street, and you were a supporter of it, but, you know, you didn't really seem to change Wall Street much. You know, and here we are, 10 years later, we're still talking to 1%, we're still having the same conversations. And kind of like gentrification, I mean, it seems like a big tidal shift. Protests that the individual can't really do much about or against. Given that we are in the age of Trump, even after Occupy Wall Street, what hope is there for the individual? And I guess what do you see? Do you have any lessons or takeaways 10 years later? And again, either or both.
Well, I think actually, in some ways, Stacie just already answered your question before you asked it, which is that there is a kind of local, like the movement from that Occupy moment it wasn't that it tore down the stock market. I mean, we live in a much bigger trap than could be overturned or solved at that moment by a kind of somehow destroying a street or a building or a concept and having that change everything. But some of the kinds of operations of local transformation, of understanding the power of individual and local collective action and mutual aid, I think really did. I mean, Occupy is such an extraordinary study because it was, I think it did change the conversation. The word capitalism was reappointed to capitalism. Suddenly it was possible in an instant to be an American anti-capitalist. And that's been true ever since that moment. That you could talk about the difference between democracy and capitalism potentially, or talk about just, I think, political philosophies. I mean, we wouldn't really be looking, I think, at the American socialism. This conversation that is treacherous and interesting exciting and confusing for a lot of people that the Democratic Party has socialism in it now. It's like you got your peanut butter and my chocolate, right? But that's an amazing thing. And, you know, I mean, this is something that I'm not authoritative on, and I don't want to speak as if I have like some encompassing reply to your very compelling, and I think, you know, I hear desire in your question, but I think political desire itself became some more tangible. The desire to find other names, other possibilities was reinvigorated by that experience. So I don't see it as some sort of, you know, thing that happened and then stopped, and now we're arguing over whether it failed or didn't. I think instead we're actually still kind of in that moment. There's a very weird, but for me very compelling theorist. He's actually a psychoanalytic theorist who writes about popular culture, named Lawrence Rickles, who lives in Berlin. I think he actually grew up in America. He might even be from Chicago. And Rickles said this thing to me, and it's in passing, but it struck me so much. He said, everyone thought that Obama represented the culmination or the end point, the finishing piece of the civil rights era. And it was exactly the opposite. The civil rights era stopped, and I think it stopped somewhere around 1971. It really ended or froze. And Obama's election was the restarting of it. And that, it shocked me because I realized, in a way, the Fortress of Solitude was about living as a child in the frozen era, coming of age in a neighborhood where my parents, who'd been, they'd gone to every protest. They felt like they were the triumphant bearers of the victory, and for that reason, wanted to live in an integrated neighborhood. Couldn't describe to me, because they couldn't admit or describe to themselves, that it was so incomplete that it was frozen, that we were in this weird stuckness. And that was the unnameable, the inexplicable, unnameable thing that was the problem in that space. And yeah, I mean, I think Occupy represents a restarting of perhaps, I wrote Dissident Gardens, and it's about the American Communist movement. And it seems so corny, it's like a greeting card, and it also sounds so ridiculous, but one of the great slogans of the American Communist movement, when they believed, and it was, before they were multiply humiliated by the totalitarian societies that they thought they should be reverent toward, like the Soviet Union. But it was also seen as potentially an organic American outcome. And there was this idea that the slogan was, communism is 20th century Americanism. In other words, the thing that had begun with the American Revolution and had perhaps itself become sort of frozen was going to get restarted in the 1920s and 1930s by people who took Marx's critique of capitalism to heart. Now, there are lots of slippages, all kinds of historical minefields for thinking about what happened to the American Communist movement. But, what if Occupyism is 21st century Americanism? And it's an open door, something that we just saw in a symbolic space in Zuccotti Park, but now is inside anyone who's thinking about it and experiencing the same desire for transformation.
I would also add that Occupy really just exists as a continuum of the organizing work that's been happening for many, many years. So I happened to be in New England at the time Occupy was happening, so had started volunteering down at the Occupy Boston site. And if I look at my peers who were also there, we're working in the library. We had the Occupy Boston A to Z library. A was for Audre Lorde, Z was for Howard Zinn. But all of my fellow librarian peers who were in on that movement, I look at the things that they're doing now, and they didn't stop doing any of the political organizing that they were doing after the camps got shut down. And what's more is that you have younger organizers, even here in Chicago, younger organizers utilizing the archives to look at older organizing efforts and really see what things worked, maybe what things didn't, and how to apply that movement to any of the issues that we're tackling right now. So even down to nonviolent disruption, or how to structure these protests. They are actively engaging in these historical efforts to try to figure out how to get this done. I would agree. I don't think that it's ever really stopped. What you've done is kind of reignited a conversation, given more people language to protest the things that they know are wrong or that they have a feeling about aren't right. And you've given them the language, you've given them the tools, and they're looking for areas in which to apply this knowledge.
Thanks.
We have a question here.
You both have talked quite a bit about the need for a certain amount of objective distance before you can sort of look at things from your past. And do you think that is there a trade-off there at all, or do you feel like it's always good? Do you feel like you lose anything in that process?
I mean, you always lose things. I'm trained as an archivist, and I will frequently tell people, you're going to lose stuff. We can't keep it all. It's just it's not possible. So you do. I think you lose things. I mean, I've tried to journal over longer periods of time so I can try to retain memory. I feel like after I had my second child, my memory is shot now. I can't remember names or locations like I used to. So I do feel like the journaling as an exercise is more important. But the things that are relevant, they stay. And for everything else, there's the library, and you can research it to make sure your memory of a thing has some accuracy to it, if that's the element that you're looking for. But I think there's also reason to suggest that maybe some of those concrete things don't even necessarily matter as you're writing. You just open it up and write.
I mean, that's such a good, complete reply. I don't need to embellish it, but it reminds me again of the value of the connections with other people. That collective memory is the collective sensorium of memory. It's captured in people's bodies, many of whom aren't necessarily writers, but who it's still present in, and you can retain that kind of connection. That's the value of a neighborhood.
So I have two questions. We'll close the public part of this. If you could each name a writer that you recommend we read, and then tell us about what you're working on for your next big project.
Sure. Writer everyone should read, Toni Cade Bambara. I love her so much. I've tattooed her work on my arm. She just writes with such an amazing voice. She has such a gift for language, and her characters are so round and dynamic, and you just want to sit in a room with them and soak up everything. She's amazing. Things that I am working on next. Really just continuing to tinker around with these short stories and decide what form I'm trying to do, and then submitting to literary journals, as one does.
Okay.
I'm so glad for the question, because it was bugging me that in tabulating, the kind of big, crazy urban books that had freed me to write Fortress of Solitude, I'd left one out, and that's Dahlgren by Samuel Delany. And he's someone who has been a writer who's been compelling to me.
I'm sorry, I didn't.
Samuel R. Delany.
Yes, okay.
And Dahlgren is the title of the book I have in mind, which is my favorite of his, and the one that obsesses me the most. But he's also written an extraordinary memoir, not an autobiographical, a beautiful memoir called The Motion of Light in Water, and countless other novels and stories, Stars in My Pockets Like Grains of Sand. And also a brilliant critic, and also in a way the model for my own creative writing teaching, which is my day job, is I teach undergraduates creative writing, and his essays and lectures on creative writing, on craft, which are always much more than just on craft, they're political and philosophical as well, are tremendous. There's a book of his called About Writing. It's kind of sounds like a catch-all sort of title, but so he's very, very important to me. I'm writing a novel set in Maine, in rural Maine, in place where there are a lot of organic farms, and that's a real place that I go to in the summers, but it's about that place after an unspecifiable kind of collapse of the internet and some other stuff. So everything gets very discombobulated, and it turns out, of course, in that situation, organic farmers become like the most important people in the world.
Okay, we look forward to that.
What was the book that the author Stacie?
Well, she's had several books, but the one of hers that I love the most is a book of short stories called Gorilla My Love.
Great. This one seems to be urgent. One more question.
Tony K. Bambara. Sorry.
Thank you. I just wanted to, I haven't actually read, well, I started to read after I read Stacie's book. I've checked it out from the library. But I just wanted to say to Stacie that I think that your book is a very important piece of writing right now that needs to be shared, and I appreciate your openness, your research, and your analysis, and how touching it was to read it. So I wanted to say thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. On that note,